Hi, welcome. Today we're joined by two partners from Oury Clark, and we're here to talk about the real estate market and the changes we've seen since the general election. Guys, please introduce yourselves.
Certainly, I'm Gemma. I'm a partner in the commercial property team at Oury Clark. We're a firm of lawyers and accountants, and we predominantly work with international companies that come over to the UK, invest within the UK.
My name's Michael. I'm also a partner in the commercial property department at Oury Clark, and we recently joined.
Right, great. So I'm going to jump straight into the questions. So following the general election, Labour is looking like they're in good shape. They want to get Britain building again. The King's speech was in mid-July. It offered some insights. Of the recent policies bills announced, what would you consider the most radical?
I suppose I'll start here. Maybe not necessarily the most radical in that it had already been, proposed in the previous Conservative government, but looking to reform laws regarding the rental market. That would certainly have, in my opinion, the most immediate effect on the property market, looking at fundamentally abolishing Section 21 default notice evictions for tenants. That, I think, will have a real and immediate change and impact on that market.
What about the leasehold freehold reforms?
No?
I was going to say, I think that for me is possibly the most radical. So certainly any property lawyer is so used to dealing with leasehold. So kind of they're talking about moving away from leasehold, possibly abolishing leasehold and moving towards common hold, which is more common, excuse the pun, within other countries like Australia, the US. They're more used to that. We're not really used to that over here, even though it's been around since 2002. So that is pretty radical for us property lawyers. And also, I would say, from an investor perspective, talk about getting rid of marriage value as well, which so shall I explain what marriage value is? So marriage value is effectively when you have a leasehold term and it gets below 80 years, you then have to pay a landlord what's known as marriage value if you want to extend the term of your lease. And so that is effectively the difference between the value of your lease at, say, a 60-year term compared to the value it would have if you had, say, a 100-year term. So as an example, if it's worth, say, £400,000 with a 60-year term and it's worth £600,000 with a 100-year term, then the difference is £200,000 and marriage value is 50% of that. So £100,000 is how much you have to pay to your landlord in order to, or to the freeholder in order to get the extension. That's what marriage value is. It's slightly, sorry if that's slightly convoluted to explain, but...
No, I think it's important for everyone to understand, especially the changes that are coming out.
And that's something that they are consulting on abolishing. So I think that is quite radical because a lot of freeholders have invested expecting at some point to possibly get that marriage value.
A lot of people still think the freehold is limited to London in some of the, more central London, sort of the older freeholders, but it's actually spread all the way across the country where a lot of pension funds.
No, absolutely. It's certainly not just limited to one particular geographical location. It's a system of ownership throughout the whole of England.
Yeah, so I think there's about 19% of all residential properties are held on a leasehold basis, and so that's throughout the country. That's a pretty significant amount. And a lot of my clients who are international investors, they will come to me and one of the first questions is, what is leasehold? Because it's a very foreign concept.
It's a very British concept.
It really is, yeah.
Okay, let's move on. There was almost a consensus between the two main parties on some of the reform bills. Do you think these measures are in touch with the industry sentiment?
Well, again, going back to, I suppose, the one I mentioned previously, the renters reform bill was the one that was introduced by the Conservative government, which got to Royal Assent in May this year. Obviously not made it through on the change of government following the election. So the new bill is the Renters' Rights Bill. A lot of very common themes running through that. One major difference is that I think the Conservative one, they focused on abolishing AST so that it would be a rolling periodic tenancy. But fundamentally, they agreed on a number of points, which was the abolition of the Section 21 notices, and effectively giving tenants much more security in respect of their occupation of these premises to prevent landlords from seeking to evict tenants on the basis of increasing rent beyond market levels perhaps, and giving them a right to stay there, building communities, giving them security. So in that sense, maybe there was consensus in the market that actually that's what people wanted, very much in favour of the tenants, but giving them much greater opportunity to remain in the occupation of these premises. I'm sure there's other things as well.
Taken as a whole, do you think this set of measures will have the desired impact on the UK housing market, increase supply and affordability?
Yes. I think in the short term, you've got the very immediate prospect of landlords taking these reforms, certainly in respect of the changes or the proposed changes to how tenants are treated. And they're looking at it presently because obviously these are bills. There's not a huge amount of specific detail that's been certainly published. These are very much snapshots as to what the government want to do until we actually see specific measures and grounds for regaining possession in respect of ASTs. Landlords are going to take a very hesitant view as to whether they remain in the market or if they even want to enter the private rental service. So for the time being, you may see some landlords try and exit, sell off some of their portfolio, because I suppose coupled with a Labour government as well, there's always this fear, perhaps unjustly, that the rates of taxation will rise, and often people think, well, if I have second or third property, I may be penalised either through an increase in capital gains tax, rather than take that risk and wait for the next budget. They think, okay, let's cut my losses now and actually just exit. An absence potentially of certainty will create maybe more supply to the property market in the short term.
But then the affordability aspect of that, I suppose, is another question. There will be that combination of more properties might go onto the market. And then I suppose they're also looking to increase supply through additional building, through planning reform as well. Then affordability, it goes along with supply, of course. But you're also very much looking at what interest rates are doing and how that affects affordability as well. And that is something that is more difficult for the government to control, I suppose, although they can influence inflation and that in turn influences the interest rate. I think interest rates and mortgage rates, that really affects the
No, I think that's exactly right. I think interest rates in particular, we're not used to particularly high rates of interest by comparison to certainly the generations before. My parents would remind me that interest rates, unless they're 15%, you don't really know what an interest rate is. Obviously, we've seen a very sharp increase in the last 2 or 3 years to a high of 5.5%. It's obviously come down to 5%, or 5.25%, but now 5%. In reality, that's going to fundamentally impact the affordability of properties and the demand for property. It's all well and good focusing on measures that increase supply. So another policy that came out was this drive to get Britain building targets of 300,000 properties or 370, depending on how you look at the length of Parliament, or 1.5 million over the next Labour government Parliament. That's a very high number to reach. But coupled with that is that under the previous Conservative government, they were reaching figures of about 235,000 new build properties a year, or additional properties. So the actual increase, and that's again, I think a figure the Office of National Statistics came out with that figure for 21 and 22. The 23 ones aren't available just yet. So it's a very big figure if people don't look at it in the whole, but actually by comparison to what had been built previously, it's still ambitious, but perhaps actually they're setting their ambitions quite low because they don't necessarily want to be found out as not being able to promote or build as many properties as they could.
Yeah, they want to meet whatever they say their target is, right? Especially given that it's their first term. So if they want to be re-elected, you do want to be hitting those targets. So I understand them putting it at that level.
Well, it makes sense. There is latent demand for property. People are looking potentially either in the rental market whilst they're waiting to find a property they can buy. But until mortgage rates come down, which obviously dictated by interest rates, people aren't necessarily going to be taking out a mortgage of 8 times salary, well, not 8 times salary, but 4 times salary, I think the mortgage rates you can get at 5.5%, 6%, but they aren't going to be doing that when they're hoping that interest rates will come down to a much more affordable 3%, 4%. especially over a large sum of money, it makes a massive difference.
There's still an expectation in the market that the rates will come down further.
True, and we're certainly seeing that mortgage companies are competing against each other, so there are reductions in interest rates being offered. So,
and certainly over longer periods of time.
Yeah. So that's very helpful. But fundamentally, until interest rates start making a big dip, if you want to call it that, then we may well see that anything that promotes supply isn't necessarily going to translate in increased sales for either the developers or end users.
So coming back to the government policies, is there anything you feel like these policies are missing?
I think the one thing that no one has really spoken much about outside of property circles is council tax, which is kind of surprising me. I'll be interested in the budget to see whether anything is raised about that. So council tax is still based on property values from 1991, whereas with business rates, we get revaluations every 3 years. With council tax, we haven't had that. And so there's this great disparity in terms of higher valued homes are still not paying probably a proportional amount of council tax compared to other lower priced properties. So that's quite an interesting one that I'll be interested to see whether they actually do anything about that. I sort of think we need to have council tax revaluations more regularly in the same way that we do with business rates, so that we don't have a sudden shock of like a complete change in council tax from 1991 values to current 2024 values. That will be a real shock. And my worry is also that you're going to get great increases in council tax in, say, London and the South East, and you're going to have reductions possibly in the North. And then if they have lower council tax bills and council tax coming in, they're going to need greater funding from central government. If they don't do something to kind of make that work, then areas that don't necessarily need as much council tax are going to have huge amounts that should be redistributed to other parts of the country if we really want a levelling up scenario.
Well, this kind of takes me to the next question, which is, do you think these steps will make the UK property more appealing destination for foreign capital?
In the short term, perhaps not, because a lot of the policies are very pro-tenant, very much weighted in favour of the individual as opposed to the investor perhaps.
Yeah.
So it may deter people whilst we're actually waiting on the detail to be published, a much clearer understanding as to how they'll actually impact the day-to-day running of a landlord portfolio, and actually the affordability aspects for that as well. But long term, perhaps more of a push towards the supply side of property. You may find that actually that some companies actually are attracting more investment as a consequence, because planning laws are hopefully being relaxed. A push to investigate certainly brownfield properties, then moving on to grey belt, green belt, that development of land that hitherto hadn't really been explored, and the change of emphasis as to the presumption that actually development elsewhere other than the green belt is something that is certainly pursued unless it has an adverse effect on the environment. When it comes to green belt, it's the opposite presumption. So maybe changing that will create an increased appetite for, I suppose, a lot more long-term investment.
I agree. I think it might be a pivot of international investment. So you might get more investment into the development and construction side of things, rather than investing into freehold buildings and ultimately expecting to get a return based off of ground rents or marriage value. I think we're going to see a pivot in how international investors invest into the UK. They may also look at commercial properties where these changes aren't being spoken about, as well, instead of residential properties, potentially. We didn't mention, but one thing is they're also looking at increasing SDLT on residential property for non-residents. That doesn't really sit right with me. I guess obviously I'm going to say that because I do act for international investors. But if you want to get the country growing, there's a few ways of doing it. One is increasing productivity here in the UK. The other is looking for greater international investments. I think we need to have more incentives to get international investment into the UK. Increasing the SDLT for international investors doesn't quite seem to work. It's an additional 1%. We're not talking about a huge increase either. But when you compare us on the international market,
The 1% makes it.
It makes a difference, exactly. So there's only a few. So Singapore charges 30% SDLT on non-resident purchases for residential property. I think Hong Kong is at 15%. But other than that, I mean, France is lower. The US has no SDLT, although they do have an annual kind of tax on resi properties. Australia is about 2 or 3%. So we are seeing quite high. So I'm not sure how much that is going to help with international investment into the UK residential market. But as I say, I just think we'll pivot and see people investing in other ways.
The structure is definitely something that's more sort of broadly thought of. I mean, it's not just vanilla, I'm going to buy a flat.
No.
There are more options out there now.
Exactly.
Absolutely so.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you guys for your time.
Thank you very much.